Welcome to the Building Spirit-Filled Homes podcast by Red Mountain Community Church. This podcast exists to help us engage with a variety of topics through a biblical lens. It is our prayer that we'll take all that we learn from these conversations and apply them to our lives so that we can make a kingdom impact on those around us, starting in our home. Thanks for joining us for our conversation today. All right, welcome back to another podcast at Red Mountain Community Church. I'm Pastor Dave, and today I have Laura Goodyear from Compassion Counseling, and we're going to dive into the topic of conflict, which we know nobody struggles with, so this should be an easy topic. But thanks for joining us, and we look forward to our conversation today. Laura, thanks for joining us again to talk about the idea of conflict, which we know is, which we talked about even a little bit earlier today, is we either kind of run from it or we think we're not supposed to experience it. Maybe we're less biblical or Christian if we're in conflict, which is total nonsense. And yet it's such a great topic to talk about because the Bible does speak to a framing or an understanding on how to engage with conflict well. So whether that's in your marriage or your friendships or your coworkers or your children, I mean, there's lots of places we could go. So through your experience and through professional knowledge, what are some good tips to engage with conflict well, or what are some things to do, not to do, or how do we just navigate the complexity of conflict?
Well, I think you hit on a key point with just our own relationship with the idea of conflict is often a little fraught, particularly as Christians. And so for a lot of us, it feels like conflict is wrong, or, you know, we're supposed to be peacemakers, and so we just shouldn't have conflict. Sure. And so I think kind of really understanding, the importance of conflict can be really helpful. And so I would start here. The first thing I would say is, first we have to understand there is a difference between peace and lack of conflict. People often think that as long as there's no sort of outward conflict, that there's peace. But true peace is not a lack of conflict. True peace is when people have, felt safe to share their perspective, and there's a sense of just safety in a relationship, and everyone's allowed to be themselves. And so I think starting there's a difference between peace and lack of conflict. And so just because there isn't conflict in your home doesn't mean there's peace. It probably just means we're all avoiding, kind of the elephant in the room, or we're avoiding talking about that hard thing. And so we really need to sort of embrace and accept the idea that conflict is a healthy part of relationships, because if a relationship has conflict to some extent, and I'll piece this out a little bit, but to some extent, if there's conflict, it means that people that are different have been allowed to show up in their differences.
Okay.
People that are different, and inevitably you and your spouse are different, you and your kids are different, have been allowed to show up with their different views, their different preferences, whatever, Chick-fil-A versus Chipotle, whatever things you disagree on, and they've had permission to disagree. And so in a healthy home, there is conflict because everyone's been allowed to show up and be a little bit different. Now, where I would nuance that a little bit, and it's funny, I looked up sort of an official definition. So dictionary.com has 2 definitions for conflict. Okay, here's the first one. To come into collision or disagreement, be contradictory, at variance. So definition number 1, to come into collision or disagreement, be contradictory or at variance. Definition number 2 of conflict is to fight or contend, do battle.
Wow.
Okay, we're aiming for number 1.
Yeah,
okay.
Seems very aggressive.
Yes, it does, doesn't it? To fight, contend, do battle. So I think we often equate conflict with number 2. That's just fighting, contending, and doing battle. Or, a conflict is something to win. As opposed to a conflict is something to resolve, right? So if we're embracing that first definition, just to come into collision or disagreement, which will happen naturally when people who are different,
Sure.
live together, then we sort of open ourselves up to everyone having permission to be there. And now the goal, instead of winning, the goal can be resolving, collaborating, repairing if there's been a rupture. So those are vastly different things. So I'll give you sort of a common example is the loading the dishwasher. Husband and wife usually have very different approaches. There's hilarious memes out there about, in every relationship, there's one who loads the dishwasher like a Scandinavian architect and one who loads it like a raccoon on meth.
Yeah.
And, they're just so funny. They're spot on for so many of us. I am the raccoon on meth in my house, okay? My husband's the Scandinavian architect. And so, but that can either become an issue where we're going to do battle and I have to win and I have to have my partner embrace my way of doing it and sort of, give in to my perspective, or I can look at it as we're always going to be different about that. We're wired differently. This is just an area where we have to find a way to collaborate together and give each other permission to be different. And so there's going to be conflict, but if I'm approaching it with that mindset, it gives us a little more space and a little more safety to have the conflict instead of pushing under the rug.
Sure. So again, it's that idea of conflict actually is a good thing when done well, but it's that idea of how are we honoring one another in that space. And the reality of it is God has probably brought us together because we're very different. And that's exciting to us until it's not.
Yes.
Right? And yet it still is. So that dishwasher analogy is great because it is that kind of thing of, when we're going into a space of conflict, is the goal to win or is it to understand and appreciate and honor? And it seems like we all learned how to do conflict in kindergarten. And then it was like, it just seems culturally, there's just been this slow drift of now for some reason we can't, argue well and still show love and honor to one another, which is, I think, a fascinating thing, even within the church, right? I wish it was one of those things we could say, hey, the church has got this figured out because we do have the tools and we do have the understanding and we do have God's word to help us navigate that well. And yet in practice, sometimes we do have to slow our roll and kind of understand, hey, this isn't about, this isn't a battle or a victory to be won. I'm engaging with an image bearer of God who is beloved, and we disagree, but let's understand why we did. Maybe it's the question is kind of like what we talked about before, like we're just not asking kind of the right questions. Like we're just trying to front load, I'm right, listen to me, do it my way, and the world will spin correctly versus help me understand your way because your way actually might be better. Or we might just do it two different ways and that's okay.
It's always so exciting when I get to work with couples and I get to see the light bulb go off when I explain to them that there is a difference between a right or wrong or a moral issue and a preference. And there are actually very few moral issues that come up in your day-to-day life with your family members.
Interesting.
How you load the dishwasher is not a moral issue. It is not a moral issue. So there is no right or wrong. We use language like right or wrong. Those are words that we assign to moral issues. Murder is wrong, right? It's a moral issue. It's not just a preference, right? So there is a vast difference between moral issues and preferences, and we need to be careful. We're often making our preferences into moral issues in our relationships, whether it's in our parenting of our kids and how our kids do something, or in how our spouse loads the dishwasher. So we need to sort of catch ourselves. We say, that's the wrong way to do something. Is it wrong, or is it just the way that you do not prefer to do
That's good. I
something.
like that.
And so we just tend to get really locked into that right or wrong when we really need to sort of untangle that in our own minds. This is a preference.
Mm.
And preferences are personal, they're unique, they're based on our life experiences, our personalities, our wiring and our wounding, I often say, drive our preferences. And so we need to sort of, appreciate that about each other and be willing to work with them. But yeah, differentiating between moral issues and preferences can really solve a lot of conflict or, put it to bed a lot faster.
Yeah, just as I'm sitting here, I'm realizing, how much of our own personal conflict that I am involved in is really about preference,
Yep.
and not again, it's not a moral issue. And so even just pausing in that space of conflict to think about, is this my preference, or like what's it's kind of that Psalm 139 passage where search me, oh God, and know if there's any grievous way in me,
Yep.
and lead me in your way everlasting. It's that great like kind of pause of like, wait, this is probably just a preference of mine.
Yes.
And like, am I making this the thing?
Yes.
And what's the consequence of that,
Yeah.
right? Because
Yeah.
it's like, okay, I may win the battle,
Right.
but like now I've fractured a relationship that is
Yes.
God given, that is a blessing. And it's
Yeah.
like, hey, so what if I'm right with an argument with my wife or
Right.
my kids? Now I've fractured that relationship. So it's going to take a lot more work to
Yeah.
restore that.
Right.
Or maybe I don't. And now we
Yeah.
start doing this.
Yes.
And then we
Yes.
wonder, oh, why are we here now?
Yep.
Well, we chose preference,
Yeah. And it's interesting. There's really interesting research out there showing when it comes to making choices in a relationship, and the way the researchers worded it was sort of me versus we choices. And so
that.
what they noticed with regard to this was with couples, for every me choice that a partner made, it took 5 we choices to balance it out in terms of the sense of safety and connection in the relationship.
Wow.
So for every one me, there need to be 5 we. Now, that's not to say it's wrong to make a me choice. It's
Sure.
not to say it's wrong to be like, I'd really like to go to whatever, the ballet tonight or whatever. And we go, and partner goes and does the thing that, but it does mean that, we do need to sort of bear that in mind all the time of like, for every time that I sort of get my way, there's a cost
Sure.
to the relationship, especially depending on how I went about getting my way. If I won the battle versus kind of talked about it and arrived at something together. And so, that 1 to 5 ratio can be helpful, to keep in mind, as well as just that idea, like you were saying earlier, of like, all of these people are made in God's image. If we could just use our imaginations to picture, a sign over the top of all of our people's heads, beloved, like each of these people in my house are beloved by God, made in his image. Do I want to create damage? Do I want to create rupture? Do I want to sort of squelch something in somebody that I love because of, I think that the toothbrushes should go this way in the bathroom?
Yeah. Or the toilet paper.
Yes, exactly. Exactly. Preference, not a moral issue, but so just bearing that in mind, but that, me versus we, sort of bearing in mind that ratio can be really helpful.
That's such a good just thought, the me over we. And it reminds me of, I think, Paul's words to the Philippians about do nothing out of selfish ambition, but thinking about the thoughts of others. That's a Dave Amy his translation, but you can get there. But it is that understanding of like, or even when we think about Christ, who laid everything aside for us. And so it is a good understanding of like in what it takes to restore that relationship of selfishness. Man, when I'm selfish, it's going to take 5 more steps to just get back to 0.
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
To not even be like
Right.
winning,
Right.
right? But
Right.
just to get back to a baseline.
Yeah.
So if I'm me, I mean,
Yeah.
I'm creating a whole bank of
You,
ridiculousness that's
yeah.
gonna take
You're going to reckon with
time.
at some point.
That's gonna, yeah, it's
Yeah.
gonna it'd be like a volcano in one
Mhm.
sense and just explode.
And the language that we use sort of, in the therapy room is rupture and repair.
Mm,
And so I think one of the things that you're pointing to there is that sometimes the hardest ruptures for us to repair are the ones that we don't know are there.
mm,
Often for partners, we know a rupture happened. We were both yelling
sure.
and we were both upset and we were clearly stating our points, or whatever. But there are times when ruptures happen and we don't know it.
Mm,
We made a choice, we made a comment, we thought we were being funny, whatever the case may be, and we didn't realize that it really it cut a little bit.
mm,
And our partner seemed fine in the moment, but there was a rupture and we don't know it. And so often those are the ones that really pile up. And by the time they come in for counseling, one partner feels so
Mm.
unseen, so hurt, so unloved, disrespected, whatever. And the other partner is like, I had no idea. How did we get here? And because they missed it, they didn't
Mhm.
realize that was a rupture. That was a rupture. They minimized it. That wasn't a big deal. That's a big, we kind of tend to do that to each other. Just because it's not a big deal to you does not mean it is not a big deal to your partner.
Mm,
Or anyone, if that, whether it's our kids, sometimes our kids can make big deal out of things that we're like, you have no perspective. This is,
Sure.
right?
Yeah.
As adults, we're like, but the reality is if it's a big deal to that person that you care about, then it needs to be a big deal to you.
mm,
And so that's another source of tremendous rupture. It might erupt in conflict or it might not. It might simmer like a volcano, but keeping close accounts with one another,
Okay.
checking in with one another is really helpful for that. So that's with partners, it's going on date night and saying, have I done anything in the last week that really hurt your feelings that we didn't talk about?
Yeah.
That sounds nice. I'm like,
Sure.
that sounds like a great idea, but actually doing it
No.
is really
true.
hard. It requires a tremendous amount of humility,
Yeah.
which I would say is a key ingredient to conflict resolution would be humility.
Sure.
But being curious and open to asking even our kids and saying, hey, I want you to know that if I've done something in the last few weeks to hurt your feelings, I hope you know that you can tell me and I'd want the chance to apologize and make it right. Oh my goodness.
And
Can that go a long
And
way?
the beauty of that is you're addressing it sooner, right? It's kind of like, it's that whole passage, don't let the sun go down on your
Yeah,
anger.
yeah.
It doesn't necessarily mean 24 hours,
Right.
but it's like the more time you
Yeah.
take, the deeper the wound's going to be.
Yes.
And so
Yeah.
how are we engaging quickly in that? One of the things that I came across years ago is just to ask a simple question, have I loved you well? And the answer is yes or no. And it's not a debate.
Yep.
It's,
Yeah, it
it's
can't be a debate.
It's a conversation of
Yep.
learning and understanding. And I think that's the key. What you're saying there
Yeah.
is you're engaging in the conversation, one, with humility, and two, to understand out of love.
Yeah.
And when we go into a conversation like that, then there's not like a double wounding, right?
Right.
Because it's like, well, now I'm hurt because you're hurt. And it's
Yeah.
like, no,
Oh.
that's not the point of the conversation.
Right.
The point is restoration, because like you said, that rupture happened.
Yep.
And
Yeah.
so what we want to do is we want to repair and restore. And the way we do that is actually engaging in spicier conversations with humility
Yes.
and without defense.
Yes.
And I think again, that's something we develop over time. Would you
Yeah.
say that's
Oh
true?
yeah.
and
I think
that
the
work-
Lord. It's a spiritual work that develops
Yeah.
that. Yeah.
that we have to work at, and
Yeah.
it's one of those things. Sometimes we're going to do it well,
Yeah.
right, and sometimes we aren't, and that's where grace comes in.
Yeah.
And so, but I think that's I see that far too often too, as well, as there's been a rupture,
Yeah.
and it's leaking and it's leaking and it's
Yeah.
leaking, and then when the conversation finally happens, so much damage has been
Yeah.
done And yet there's a practical tool per se,
Yes.
right?
Yeah.
Which is just engagement
Yep.
with love, respect, honor, and humility.
Right.
And so,
But
that's
we
wonderful.
often avoid that engagement. We
sure.
avoid that conversation because we're not sure how to navigate it. Sometimes there's a lot of different reasons why we do. And sometimes it's just because we never saw it go well in our family of origin. And so even though we might not be thinking that in our head, we might not, you might not be sitting at date night and thinking like, this never went well in my family of origin, therefore I'm going to avoid this conversation.
Right.
It's happening in you. It's happening. And so I think that's where, spending some time reflecting on your own experience is really helpful. That's where the therapy room can be really helpful. I think, when couples come to me for couples work, they often come, I'll say, what are you hoping to get out of the therapy experience? And I usually hear tools, we need some tools for communication, tools for conflict resolution. But here's the thing, here's what I find. Usually the problem isn't lack of information. Those of us that have a lot of conflict and problems in our relationships, it's not because we don't know you should apologize when you're wrong, do you know what I mean? It's not a lack of information. Nobody's like, wow, it never occurred to me that I should not yell and scream and lose my mind. Like, it's not a lack of information that's undermining this process. What's happening is there's things we don't understand that are getting triggered inside of us that are stopping us from being able to use the information. So we can spend every therapy session with me giving you worksheets and tools and say, just do this. But if you haven't dealt with and explored, why is it so hard for me to do that? Why do I instantly feel flooded? My face is red, my heart is racing. I'm so anxious or angry or whatever. I got to reckon with that because that's not an information problem. That's a wiring, wounding problem.
So what you're saying is getting to the kind of rootedness, the thing behind kind of thing. And that's really a beautiful space to meet with the Lord and say, hey, why is this bring out this
so
in
triggering?
me?
Yeah.
And then providing the space to care for one another, to hear the rootedness of that. Because I think there's a lot of fear and probably shame, all kinds of things of the evil one that doesn't want that rootedness to be explored, right? Because when you bring the darkness into light, it no longer has power.
That's right.
And the challenge in that is humbly receiving and allowing your spouse or your kid to say, hey, let's explore like what's actually going on here, and being for them in that and not being defensive or, because you might be part of that problem, or you might be adding to that, and just own it. Right. Just own it, but say, hey, we're trying to figure out what's the deeper thing here. So
it's where, self-awareness is probably your greatest tool in conflict resolution. The tools that I'll, give you in therapy about, listening tools, all those things, those are great, but your greatest tool in conflict resolution is self-awareness. If you can be able to be constantly taking your own temperature and knowing what's going on inside of you. And that's the hardest part. And that's where so many of my clients struggle of like, I don't know, I went from 0 to 100. But then when we back it up, and when we explore and when we talk, it turns out like, oh, you didn't go from 0 to 100. You went from 75 to 100. Your baseline was 75. That's how stressed you are or how upset you are about this thing, or any number of things. Like self-awareness is going to help you recognize in the moment, I am activated to the point that this will no longer be a fruitful conversation. So I need to ask for a timeout. So one of the tools we talk about in therapy is asking for a timeout. You'll never be able to do it if you don't have the self-awareness to know you need it. So you've got to be able to have enough self-awareness to go, I can feel myself getting so angry. I'm going to say something I'm going to have to apologize for later. And I hate apologizing. So I think I'll just ask for a timeout. But I have to be able to take my own temperature to then be able to use that tool and say, I think I need a timeout. I feel myself getting really upset and I want to be able to do this conversation well. So self-awareness is a huge piece. And that's where, that takes spending time with the Lord, spending time with other believers, having a mentor, having, friends that speak into our lives. We've lost our sense of community in
Absolutely.
so many ways in the way that our world works, right? But community helps sharpen us and, helps people in our lives become mirrors. I mean, we always talk about our children being our mirrors,
Sure.
but even our friends, we watch how they handle things. We go, that's not a good look. Oh, I think I do that too,
Right.
So, we get that self-awareness in a lot of different ways, whether that's through prayer and reflection and journaling, whether that's through quality time with quality people who are going to give us good feedback, or whether that's through, some therapeutic work if we've got things we just don't understand that are happening inside of us.
Sure.
But self-awareness is huge.
Yeah, I love that the communal aspect and what you said there is good feedback, because
Yeah.
we can surround ourselves with people who will just tell us what we want, right?
Right.
Those are it sounds great, but it's actually terrible.
Yep.
But yeah, even being in that authentic community where somebody can say,
Yeah.
"Hey, Dave, like, are you okay, man?"
Yeah.
Like, your response isn't how I know you to be,
Right.
and then me receiving that, because sometimes, right, it's hard to know, it's hard to be self-aware.
Absolutely.
And so
Absolutely. We all
you
have blind
need-
spots. They're
you
called that for a
need
reason.
You need that community
Yep.
to lovingly
Yep.
call you up. And the Bible is clear that that's a good and a blessing to have that community, and it takes time to build that. But I love that understanding of you do need to be self-aware in order to call time out. But then it also takes practice, right?
It does.
You got to do it,
Yep.
right? It's what
Yep.
you said before. You can have all the knowledge in the world and epically fail
Yes.
over and over
Yeah.
again. But it's what are we, and that's one of my hopes through these podcasts, is as we have these conversations and we talk about these things, and as tools are presented, it's like, okay, now what are you doing with it now?
Yeah.
It's one thing to listen to a
Yeah.
podcast and be like, oh, that sounded great.
Yeah.
Or, oh, we should do that.
Yeah.
But if you don't do it,
Right.
like, you're not going to see the fruit of anything.
And anything that you're ever going to do well, you're going to do terribly first.
Sure. Absolutely.
Right? Whether you're learning how to oil paint or you're learning how to resolve
Yeah.
conflict. So you have to embrace that this is going to be messy
It's
as we
clunky.
try and use these
Yeah.
tools. Yeah. And so eventually you'll get better at it, and it will go much better, and you'll check in with each other, and you'll read each other better, and you'll read yourselves better, and conflict won't be so messy, but it's going to be messy at
Yeah.
first. And so you do have to kind of embrace that a little bit. And sometimes, again, that's really hard for people because either they're perfectionists
Sure.
and they want to get it right out of the gate, or they're terrified of conflict because that means maybe we're not good Christians or everything's going to fall apart. They've
Right.
kind of maybe have seen conflict in their lives, in their family of origin. I saw conflict happen, and then that led to a divorce and my life falling apart.
Mm.
And so I don't want any conflict. And so, okay, let's talk about that. Is it,
Absolutely.
can we help you feel safe with some amount of conflict? Can we help you? But yeah, we've got to try.
Yeah.
We've got to engage the tools, and we've got to accept, like, it's going to be a little messy. It might not always go perfectly.
Well, I always think of the analogy of, like, as our children are learning to progress from crawling to walking,
Yeah.
right? We
Yeah.
don't, like, tell them they're terrible.
No.
Like,
right.
when they fall down, what do? We encourage them.
Yeah. Great job.
Hey, good job.
We're
We
getting
cheer
there.
them on. Hey, you're getting there. If we just gave up on them, we'd all be scooting around on our butts,
Right.
right? Which would be terrible.
Right.
So it is that understanding. Sometimes you have to kind of go to a ridiculous analogy to say, hey, like,
Yeah.
what would happen to our children if we stopped cheering them on as they walked? If we just gave up on them?
Right.
So hey, it's gonna be messy. It's gonna be clunky. But guess what? We're here for you. God's for you, and this is how we grow, and this is how
Yeah.
we move through it. So I love just that idea of conflict is a process, right? It's that long walk. It's a journey, and I don't know. I mean, would you say we ever arrive,
Nope.
or it's more of
Nope.
just
No, we'll
it's just a
always be working
continual-
on it. It will always be challenging. We will always find new ways for it to be challenging. And I mean, just life is full of surprising twists and turns. And, I mean, it's kind of like parenting with, I remember feeling like, okay, this kid is 6 months old and we've got the hang of it. And then, like, and then everything goes sideways because they start teething or they start, or they have separation anxiety. And you're like, I feel like I just got the hang of this parenting thing. And now I don't know what to do at all with them.
Sure.
And, I think that's same even in our relationships. Personally speaking, my husband and I have done a ton of work on our relationship. We've worked so hard. We've read the books. We've had all these hard conversations. We've done so much work. And yet, we still have our moments. We still have our seasons that are really hard and stressful where sort of the worst of us comes out. And then we're like, ooh, we're back there. But, I often tell people 10 steps forward and 9 steps back is still 1 step forward.
I like that.
To your point about the crawling and like encouraging, 10 steps forward and 9 steps back is still 1 step forward. We're going to get there. And so I find that people kind of give up, like, well, I tried that. I tried this conflict resolution tool, or I tried sharing how I felt and it didn't go well, so I'm never doing that again. And I'm like, well, let's keep trying. Let's hit it from another angle. Let's see, was there anything that good that came of it? Did we get 1 step forward? Okay, we got 9 steps back. Did we get 1 step forward? Let's keep building on that. But again, that fear of the conflict or the fear of getting hurt might be something we need to do some intentional work kind of reckoning with a little bit. Or conversely, the over-eagerness to engage in conflict.
Sure. Yeah.
So there might be that too, where you've got one partner who's like, this conversation isn't over. We have to, and they're pushing and conflict seems like it's the only way they know how to connect. Like, okay, we got to reckon with that a little bit. What's going on that you crave conflict, or you feel like this, I can't connect unless there's something that we're kind of debating about or whatever, so that's where some of that self-awareness comes in, and paying attention to our own story and how have I been shaped, and how is that impacting how I engage this with someone I love.
And a lot of that can even just come down to processing too, right? It's people are short processors and long processors. And so if you're in the middle of conflict and both of you, one wants to end it now and one needs to think about it, like you're not going to be able to come to resolution unless you pause to understand you both need to process it differently. And how do we care for each other in that? So,
which brings me back to right or wrong or preferences, right? We often think my partner wants to just, doesn't want to give me time to process this. My partner's not doing it right.
Sure.
And the other partner's like, my partner always needs a break and needs to process this for 3 days. They're not doing it right.
Sure.
No. This is not a right or wrong issue. This is not a moral issue. Your partner's not doing it wrong. They're doing it differently, and that bothers you. And so helping people, and whether that's your partner or your spouse, or whether that's a friend or whatever, understanding just because this person handles conflict differently from you doesn't mean that they're doing it wrong and you're doing it right. I mean, there are ways. There's abuse. There's ways that we do it very, very poorly. But a lot of times that's another piece that I see show up, is people kind of feeling like the way that they do it is the right way. So their partner's not doing it right. And so they're like, they come to me, the couples counselor, and say, all right, tell my person they're not doing it right.
And I can even see it sometimes, people, right, wrong, or indifferent, weaponize scripture too. So what they'll do is they'll say, well, doesn't the Bible say like we shouldn't let the sun go down on our anger? And that's what they're doing. Right. So like, I'm being more Christian, and it's like, no. You're taking the whole thing out of context, and you're misunderstanding the thought behind it. And so even in that, there can be challenges in that. So it's understanding, the idea is to deal with it. Don't let it just fester or pretend like it never happened. Deal with it rightly in the right time, and honor each other's preferences. Acknowledge, hey, you tend to like to deal with things quickly. It takes me a minute. And if you don't let me deal with it, if you don't give me the minute, I'm going to say something ornery, and now we're going to have a bigger conflict.
That's right. We're going to have an even bigger problem.
I love that. I love that idea, though, of it. One, seeing each other in that, but two, just the endurance that is developed kind of in conflict. It reminds me of that passage, suffering produces endurance, character, and character hope. Well, that whole thing begins with suffering. Which again, we don't like, but it's in that enduring together through the power of the Spirit and understanding of God's greater plan for us and the restoration of all things. we can develop, we need to develop endurance, because like
Yeah.
we said, conflict isn't a destination. It's this thing where we're going to ebb and flow through, and we're going to grow through it. We're going to be shaped by it. But how do we continue to learn how to do that
Yeah.
well? And how's the Bible shaping our understanding of loving each other,
Yeah.
and recognizing, oh, that's a preference.
Yes.
That's not an absolute. That's my preference.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so I think that's a huge takeaway again, is
Yeah.
like, what my preferences might be controlling more of the conflict than I realize. And that's hurting our relationship.
Yes.
That, and I love the idea how you said, I think it was bringing it up, something along those lines of dealing with it.
Yeah,
right
just
away.
asking, like,
Just
is there
asking,
any way that I've hurt you that
that's
I'm
what
not
it
aware
was.
of?
Yeah, what am I not
absolutely.
aware of? And being
Absolutely.
okay with that.
Again, but all of these pieces take so much humility, right?
Yeah.
Self-awareness requires some humility, because inevitably, if I ask the Lord, search me and know me, try me,
Sure, yeah.
He's going to tell me something.
Yeah.
It's not, He's going to reveal sin to me. He's going to reveal something less attractive about me, right? And so I have to have the humility to receive that from the Lord. If I ask my partner, is there any way that I've hurt you this week, that I've ruptured? And then if I'm going to do it well, I have to have the humility to receive it, even if it wasn't my intention. And this is another big piece that people get caught up on, whether it's spouses or friends or whatever. In every conflict, there is a hurter and a hurtee, so to speak. Okay,
Sure.
There's a hurter and a hurtee, and sometimes you're each both.
Sure.
Sometimes you've both been hurt and you've hurt one another. Okay, so what happens in the conflict is that the hurtee says, "This hurt me. I didn't like this." And they're really focused on sort of the results. What you did hurt me. It caused me a lot of pain. And the hurter tends to focus on their intentions. I didn't mean to do that. That's not what I meant. Basically excusing themselves, right? And so what we need, if we're going to come to some resolution, if we're going to understand each other, if we're going to give each other some benefit of the doubt, work our way towards some sort of forgiveness and repairing the rupture, what we need is the hurter, the person who's just received this feedback, to focus on the results more than the intentions. Okay? And we need the hurtee to focus more on intentions than results. So I'll give you kind of a dramatic example. If we are we're leaving the church parking lot, and I accidentally run over your foot, and I get out of the car, I'm like, oh my gosh. And you say, you ran over my foot.
Right.
And I say, well, I didn't mean to.
Yeah, right.
Do you care what my intentions were in that moment? Or are you are more concerned with the results?
Right.
Like, oh my gosh, the agony. You're concerned with the results. If I only concern myself with my intentions, I didn't mean to, I was focusing on this thing, then any apology I make is going to seem so hollow, right? And it's not going to repair this rupture. Instead, what you want to hear from me is, oh, sure, oh my gosh, it was an accident. I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry that happened. Oh my gosh, you must be in so much pain. How can I make it better? Do you want me to drive you? You probably don't want me to drive you to the ER. I'm clearly not a good driver.
Yeah.
But how can I make it right? And I'm like, validate your pain. That's terrible for you. Even though that wasn't my intention. Right? That's going to make a difference for you. And that's going to lead us towards repairing the rupture. So that's what I'm talking about for the hurt. Even if you didn't intend it, can you focus on the results of your behavior, your words, and apologize for those? Like, I'm so sorry I hurt you. That wasn't my intention, but I'm so sorry I hurt you. Oh my goodness, does that go a long way? And then for you, now you as the victim and with your foot run over, you could just focus on that and be like, no, it hurts, it's still hurting. I am unwilling to give you any benefit of the doubt. I am unwilling to even entertain the idea that it was unintentional, because often what we do particularly when people are close, when partners hurt each other, the person who's hurt assumes that person meant to hurt me. They meant to wound me like that, even though most of the time they didn't.
Right.
They're just acting out of their own, hurt or wounding or whatever. Sure. And so can you give the other person that benefit of the doubt that says, okay, I'm going to try and believe that you did not mean to hurt me, to run over my foot or whatever. And I'm going to work on forgiving. So that's another way that I try and explain it to people and help them kind of work through that process. And also, if you're both hurting, it's easy for, for the person receiving the feedback to just retaliate with their own hurt, but you got to sort of trust the process. And so, okay, we've both been hurt. My partner is sharing with me their hurt. I'm going to first repair that rupture, and then I'm going to share with them mine. But instead, what we tend to do is jump to our hurt and like, oh yeah, you think I hurt you? Wait until I tell you how you hurt me. Not helping, not helping. And so if you can just focus, there's going to be time for you. You're going to get heard. You're going to, if we can just do one at a time, it'll allow both people to feel heard. And those are some of the steps towards repairing a rupture.
So it seems like the overarching theme as we come to a close in this conversation, again, we could talk about conflict for days, is really just a heart of humility.
Yeah.
Am I humbly going into this situation and am I able to see my own part in it? Yeah. And am I able to look at the best and assume the best of the person who's hurt me, done whatever against me? So it really seems like just the heart of humility tends to be a really key component. Yeah. So as we're engaging in conflict, what's my humble meter, right? Right. Where, am I going into this with a humble heart, or am I just trying to win a battle? Yeah. And be right, or,
Absolutely. And a verse that I love that I often return to myself it's in 1 Peter 5 somewhere. And it says, God opposes the proud, but gives grace to the humble.
Yeah.
And so I'm always like, God opposes the proud, but gives grace to the humble. So I'm very upset with this person right now, and I would like him to oppose them, not me. So I will choose humility, hoping I get some of God's grace.
Pride. You don't win with pride in the Bible, but humility, like you're saying, comes with blessing. Yes. And so it's like, why would we not pursue humility if it comes with blessing when we know pride just brings destruction?
Yes.
So that's a great way to end our time, is just to be reminded of, search the scriptures for humility and understand the blessing that comes from that, and understanding that conflict is a long walk. It's a journey that shapes us, strengthens us, but doesn't necessarily, we don't have to avoid it.
That's right.
We don't have to allow it to control us. We can restore those ruptures, because they will happen. But there is a pathway back. So thanks, Laura, so much for sharing with us again today. And I've just been blessed by our conversation and look forward to more. And thank you for all that you do as one of our biblical counselors, and the way you continue to care for our people in various stages of need for healing and restoration. And so
it's my pleasure.
Appreciate all you do for the kingdom, and thanks.
Thank you.